All right. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. We're ready to roll now. Sorry for the delay. There we go. Thank you. For those of you who do not know, my name is Matt Green. I am president of our local Federalist Society chapter here in Mobile. It's the Brevard Hand Alex Howard chapter. We're very excited to host tonight author and attorney J. Christian Adams. What I'm going to do briefly is tell those of you who have not, I see some new faces in here tonight, a little bit about our group and how you can follow us and be notified of future events. And then I'm going to turn the podium over to Mr. Quinn Hillier, who more than anybody has made tonight's speaker possible, and he will do the introduction for Mr. Adams. The Federalist Society is a nonpartisan, conservative, and libertarian organization dedicated to freedom, federalism, and judicial restraint. The Federalist Society seeks to promote, through the legal community, its programs and publications about how limited constitutional government based on the rule of law can have a positive effect on law and public policy. And I can't think of a more timely and important speaker that will speak on the issues that we hold dear at the Federalist Society than Mr. Christian Adams. For those of you who do not know, Mr. Adams is author of the book Injustice in Alabama. This is a copy of it, exposing the racial agenda of the Obama Justice Department. You can find it fairly cheaply on Amazon, and I would highly encourage you, each of you, after you listen to his presentation tonight, you'll be intrigued into purchasing it. You can follow Christian on Twitter. He is at Election Law CTR, ELECTION LAW Election Law Center on Twitter. You can follow our local chapter as well at Mobile AL Chapter, and we're also on Facebook, facebook.com Hand Howard, named after two of our federal judges here in the Southern District. We're very excited to have Mr. Adams with us tonight. And at this time, I will turn the podium over to Mr. Hillier.
Well, thank you, Matt, very much. And as Matt said, our guest tonight is lawyer, whistleblower, author, and columnist J. Christian Adams. And I will get to a more formal introduction in a minute. You should know, though, that the very first time I ever spoke to Christian, he said he couldn't talk to me, and he sent me to a Justice Department press flack named Schmaler, who proceeded to yell and curse at me like a Greek fury before I ever had two very polite sentences out of my mouth. On the other hand, many months later, the first time Christian would talk to me on the record, the result was that I got the chance to impress Fox News' Shannon Bream, who later put me on the air with her about 6 times. The moral of the story is that things are a lot better when Christian speaks up. Ever since he did start speaking up, the entire public square has been far better off, and I think you'll think tonight that you are better off once you've listened to Christian speak. But just since I use that as an introduction, the fuller story, sort of funny, is this. I was working for the Washington Times, and I was one of the team that broke a big story you may have heard of about the Justice Department dropping what was basically an already won voter intimidation case against new Black Panther thugs in Philadelphia. Well, Christian was the lead Justice Department attorney who brought and won that case before the Obama political team nixed it. That's why I was trying to talk to him, but under a gag order from the Obamites, Christian sent me to Tracy Schmaler, who yelled at me and who later developed quite a reputation for going berserk on numerous reporters for almost no reason. Anyway, it was a full year after we first broke the story that Christian finally resigned from the Justice Department in protest and testified before the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. On the way into the commission's building to cover that hearing, I saw Shannon Bream and her Fox team staking out the entranceway. And I introduced myself as the guy who had helped break the Black Panther story that he was testifying about. She was polite, but she hardly seemed impressed. But after Christian's riveting testimony, I noticed him and his attorney going down a back stairwell, and I followed them. We walked to a garage 4 full blocks away before he would finally talk on the record. So I got a great interview. And then I went back to the commission building to see if I could find any of the commissioners to interview. When I walked in, there was the Fox team still staking out the ground floor, hoping for an interview with Christian. Shannon stopped me and asked me if I knew when he was coming down. And I was able to say nonchalantly, "Oh, he's long gone. He went out a back way." I just interviewed him at length. I saw her face show disappointment, and then, to her credit, she sort of laughed as if to say, "Well, you got me that time." And Shannon's been great to me ever since. Thanks, Christian, for letting me follow you. You opened up a very important door for me. Anyway, after his dramatic testimony, Christian, who was no longer under the gag order because he was no longer at Justice, having resigned in protest, he became a frequent source for me and eventually a friend, as I reported repeatedly about nefarious doings at the Justice Department. As I got to know him, what I found was a brilliant lawyer, absolutely dedicated to civil rights and equal justice under the law, one who idolized some of the great speeches of Martin Luther King Jr., and who had worked on and won numerous cases on behalf of Black and Hispanic victims of civil rights violations. But in the midst of those numerous cases on behalf of Black and Hispanic victims, Christian dared take a whopping 2 cases, just 2, against Black perpetrators with both Black and white victims. The Obama team and left-wing media began mistreating him and then attacking him with reckless abandon. Christian has stood up against every bit of it. He now writes a great column at Pajamas Media. He runs a superb legal blog, or a blog, as they say, called Election Law Center. He still works as an attorney on high-profile cases, and he has written an absolutely top-notch book, which Matt mentioned, one of the best, most convincing, most accessible books on legal subjects I've ever seen. It's a really good read. It's not just on legal stuff. It's a good story. It's called Injustice, and which has made him a frequently mentioned hero for many radio talk show hosts coast to coast. Christian is a Pittsburgh native, a graduate of the University of West Virginia and of the University of South Carolina Law School. He's former general counsel to the Secretary of State of South Carolina, and for 5 years he served as an attorney in the voting section of the Civil Rights Division of the Federal Department of Justice. Since leaving DOJ, his high-profile cases have included jointly representing the presidential campaigns of Newt Gingrich, Rick Santorum, and John Huntsman in a Virginia primary election dispute. A member of the South Carolina and Virginia bars, a top-notch legal mind, and an all-around good guy, I'm proud to introduce you to Christian tonight.
Thank you very much, Quinn, for that great introduction that I did not deserve, and I never knew that Shannon was looking for me. Had I known that, I still would have gone into the garage with you, because so much good happens in Washington, D.C. parking garages. I'm serious about that. Thank you all for having me. Thank you, Matt, for putting this together. You guys are blessed with a very good Federal Society Lawyers chapter here. I've heard of some of the other speakers you've had, so I have a lot to keep up with tonight. This is my first time in Mobile. I've been to Birmingham tons of times. I actually went through Montgomery and Selma to write my book. There's a photograph I would refer you to in the book that I took in Selma, actually a bunch of photographs from Selma that are in the photo section. But somebody that heard I was coming to Mobile, and I know some of you have heard this story, said to me, oh, if you're going to Mobile, then you definitely need to go see the USS Tecumseh. And so I thought, well, now that's interesting. They know I'm sort of a war Navy buff, and I like to go see historical things. So I started researching it, and the USS Tecumseh is down on the bottom of Mobile Bay. And so I think that they knew that I would eventually figure this out. It was sunk by a mine when I was trying to get into Mobile Bay, so there will be no trip to the Tecumseh today. I'm going to try to cover a number of things with sort of an Alabama focus, but I'm going to weave in some broader themes that should appeal to both lawyers and non-lawyers, but most of all people who love liberty and the rule of law, because that's ultimately what everything I'm going to talk about revolves around. For the last 3 weeks, anybody who's been paying attention has seen these scandals unraveling at a rapid pace, like I haven't seen in a very, very long time. Now, in some ways, I wish I wasn't standing before you tonight to talk about this, away from my family, my wife who doesn't like me to travel much, but I'm happy to be here because I like to talk about these things because they're so important, I think, to the rule of law and to what makes this country special. In some ways, I wish I was back at the Justice Department, going about my civil service job, doing voting rights cases, which is a great joy to work at the Civil Rights Division at the U.S. Department of Justice. It was truly a wonderful experience. I had the occasion once to actually sue Alabama. It's a case called United States versus Alabama that's dreadfully boring, so I won't talk about it, but it involves record-keeping issues of military ballots. It doesn't get much more boring than that. But the things that I first started to see at the Justice Department in 2009, after the inauguration, in the middle of the new Black Panther litigation, are the sorts of things that our American Constitution and our American experiment in a democratic republic simply cannot abide. They are an anathema to the system of government, of checks and balances, and most of all, the rule of law. Let's just think about the last 3 weeks. We have an administration that has been targeting reporters, whether it's James Rosen at Fox News, William LaJeunesse, possibly Cheryl Atkinson at CBS News, having their emails hacked, all through the use of a Justice Department subpoena. Now, when I was at the Justice Department, I actually did a media subpoena once. I had some litigation in federal court in Mississippi, and we needed to get evidence from a reporter for a very large, famous national newspaper that I will not mention. And there are clear guidelines for getting a Justice Department subpoena. They're literally in the Code of Federal Regulations. You can look it up. CFR, I don't have the exact code site, it's about 58 dot something. It's in the Justice Department regs. And so the Code of Federal Regulations lays out the steps to get a subpoena. Now, why is this? Why should they reduce this process to a regulation? The answer is because the federal government compelling a news media or a news organization to give up evidence of sources and statements is one of the most sensitive and powerful things that the Justice Department can do. If it goes back to the days of, frankly, of whether or not the king has the power to compel the press. And so it's wrapped up in the First Amendment and it's codified in Justice Department regulations. There's 3 things in those regulations that I had to abide by when I subpoenaed this newspaper that it does not appear that this administration abided by. Number 1, you're supposed to try to negotiate a resolution. Now, their response is, well, we couldn't let them know we were investigating them. So we couldn't clue them in that we wanted the information. Okay, well, let's go to the second step, and that is to use the least intrusive means possible. In contrast, it looks like this Department of Justice used the most intrusive means possible, and that is to harvest all of the phone logs and records of the reporters. And thirdly, it's supposed to be personally approved by the Attorney General. That way, the buck stops with the AG. There's accountability of the political branch because one person personally signed off. When my subpoena request was made, I made it to Alberto Gonzales himself. And Alberto Gonzales had to sign the document that I prepared. All three of these safeguards were tossed when it came to the Associated Press, Fox News, maybe CBS, and who knows who's next. Next, we find in the last 3 weeks that the IRS has been targeting Tea Party groups. Alas, not just Tea Party groups, pro-life groups, conservatives, people who have spoken out against the government. They've targeted them for audits. I was actually audited, believe it or not. I've never been audited in 2 decades, but after the new Black Panther case, I was audited. Thankfully, they owed me $100. So keep the audits coming. They're also asking questions such as, what books do you read? This is the IRS. Tell us the content of your prayers said at meetings. Seriously, this is in the IRS questionnaires. Tell us your members, your volunteers. They have been targeting pro-life Christians in this Justice Department. Look up FACE case, FACE, F-A-C-E, Federal Access to Clinics. The Civil Rights Division where I used to work has been bringing lawsuits against Christian and Catholic groups who are outside abortion clinics peacefully protesting. You say, well, there's a question of fact. Actually, there isn't. Federal judges have said these cases were brought improperly and have thrown them out on summary judgment and assessed sanctions against the Justice Department lawyers up to $120,000 each. These are being thrown out of federal court across the country over and over and over again, and the people being targeted are being targeted because of their beliefs. It's a fact. Here's one for you probably haven't read. The Justice Department has been targeting public schools that prohibit children from dressing in drag. I know that sounds absolutely preposterous. It's in the book. A citation to the case. It's against the Mohawk Unified School District is one in upstate New York. An 8th grade boy came dressed up in drag with a pink wig, a mini skirt, and stilettos. And the school said, you can't come to school this way. This is disruptive. The Justice Department under Eric Holder brought a lawsuit against the school district for gender identity discrimination and said under the civil rights laws, which prohibit sex discrimination, that you're discriminating against this boy for how he feels about himself. The school district settled the case and currently has to pay tens of thousands of dollars a year as part of the settlement in gender identity sensitivity training. It's all in the book with code citations.
Taught by former DOJ.
Yeah, with consultants recommended by the Justice Department. The Justice Department has been targeting states like Alabama, who have passed immigration-related statutes involving immigration laws and people who are here illegally. And the things that I've just gone through, the roster of targets, barely scratches the surface. If you gave me 4 hours to talk about other targets, we would not exhaust the list. But this gives you a sense of what is happening in the country today. Now, for a moment, before I sort of get into the fun election stuff about Alabama, I want to pose the question, how did we get here? How did we get to this point where these outlandish, abusive, legal cases are acceptable by the executive branch of government? Now, I have a theory about this, and it's one I'm at a disadvantage because you all live in a place in the country that's still sane. So some of the things that I talk about will be difficult unless you've been exposed to the insanity of Washington, D.C., or all points north and east of there. It will seem preposterous. But let me tell you the 2 models that are out there. How did we get here? There's 2 different worldviews. The first worldview is the sane worldview that you're probably familiar with. It's the kind of legal education that is taught in places like Tuscaloosa, Birmingham, and Montgomery. And that is this, that the legislature passes a law using words we all recognize and generally agree on, and attorneys in the executive branch enforce the law. The law, to these people in this first sane world that I'm describing, the law is viewed as a fence, outside of which lawyers do not go. They do not stray beyond the confines of the language and the statutes, because that is what the rule of law is. It's a constraining force on government. For example, in the civil rights era, the idea of a government acting with racial intent is a violation of the 15th Amendment. It's common black letter law. If you act with a racial intent, you violate the 15th Amendment in a voting issue, in an election issue. Keep that in mind when I describe the parallel universe I'm about to describe. That is the second model. Remember, the first model is the sane one you're all familiar with, that the law acts like a fence. The second model that is beginning to pervade places like Washington, D.C., the Justice Department, the elite law schools we all have heard about, is this one. It is fashionable to believe that the law is a suggestion, that the law, instead of being a fence, is a navigational beacon steering you to a distant shore. You pass it on the way to your destination. Sometimes you pay it homage and quote it, but then you turn and twist it into something that allows you to achieve a goal, a result, a cause of action, a judgment that the legislature never said you could. The legislature, in the old days, built fences. To these people, the law is a navigational beacon you go right on by. And I can give you example after example, some of which I've already given you. Gender discrimination becomes gender identity perception. It's a great example. Now, the Justice Department lawyers that I used to work with are totally consumed by this second model of the law being a suggestion. There is a man named Tom Perez who's been nominated to be the Labor Secretary. Some of you may have heard of him. He's a radical's radical. He proudly adopts the second version of the second model that I've given you as law as a suggestion. He proudly has stated that you have to, quote, push the envelope, unquote. That law is a means to an end. And a lot of this comes, I won't get into it very deeply, but it comes out of the crits at Harvard, a critical race theory, critical legal studies that views law as an instrument of power. That once you get it, you use it to achieve your ultimate goals. And so what you have, folks, are these two differing visions of what the rule of law means. And that is going to affect everything else I talk about tonight. Because I'm sorry to say that that second model is the one that is beginning to permeate the Justice Department, Washington, D.C., and the profession generally in places that aren't sane, like here in Mobile, Alabama. And why is this bad? I'm reminded by, if you've ever seen A Man for All Seasons, where St. Thomas More is arguing about the law, and he's arguing with all the king's men, and he's saying, look, we can't ignore the law because that's what keeps us off each other's throats. Civilization is built on the idea that we have predetermined rules of behavior by government, that they can't go beyond the fence. And if they do, they endanger all of us, because the next person to go beyond the fence is after you, even if the first time they weren't. So that's what the rule of law ultimately is. Now, this isn't political. This isn't a case where Republicans agree with my first model and Democrats are behaving badly in the second model. This transcends politics. There's a lot of Democrats who believe in my first model, a lot of them in the South. But this is not a Republican or Democrat issue. This is a cultural issue, and there is a transformative effort being made in the culture about the law to create a new paradigm. And I know that sounds a little outlandish, but how else do you explain the cases I just started to tell you about, unless you're willing to go outside the boundaries of the law? Well, let me give you some of Alabama. Let's turn to Alabama. I spend a lot of time in my book, Injustice, talking about Alabama. I counted about 11 pages about Hale County and Perry County, Alabama. I don't know, it's north of here, it's up near Selma, sort of. And I have three main election stories I want to share with you. I think the title of this event tonight was How the Justice Department Endangers Free and Fair Elections in Alabama. So the three main topics I'm going to talk about as far as elections go are Hale and Perry County and how they represent these two different worldviews that I just talked about and how it intersects with the Justice Department. Because the DOJ has a big footprint up there, and you're not going to like what I have to tell you about it. The second thing I'm going to talk about is voter ID, because your legislature passed a voter ID law that is still not in effect. And that voter ID law is right at the intersection of these two worldviews that I talked about. Those two theoretical worldviews that I just talked about, A and B, the fence and the navigational beacon, are exactly what the voter ID debate is wrapped up in. And thirdly, I'm going to talk about dead people on the voter rolls, because you've got a serious problem in this state. And I'll get to that last. So let's start with Hale and Perry County, Alabama. As I said, I devote 10 pages of my book to it. And Hale and Perry County have had a pervasive problem with voter fraud over the last 12 or 13 years. You have there all manner of criminality in local elections. I mean, it's so outlandish. Again, I write a lot about it in the book, but let me try to summarize some of the things. Two main things are happening there. One is forced assistance. People are grabbing people as they go into the polls, and and they're voting for them. They're wranglers. These are wranglers who grab people by the dozens and dozens and dozens. Now, that might not make a difference in some county sheriff race to all you down here, but I promise you that's going on in the general election for statewide office, for U.S. Senate. And I don't know if a congressional district snakes down here from there, but it's affecting the entire state. Now, the other thing that's happening there is absentee ballot fraud. You have these notaries, these trained professional harvesters of ballots that run around the county and vote people in their houses. They grab their ballot out of the mailbox, they knock on the door, they're trusted individuals who everybody knows, and they're marking ballots in Hale and Perry County, Alabama, by the hundreds. By the hundreds. Now, excuse me. There are some vigilant people in that part of the country who got your attorney general involved a number of years ago in Alabama. Thank you. And ultimately, 3 people were arrested. Their names are Gail Tinker, Vlada Banks, and Rosie Lyles. These 3 women were arrested for absentee ballot fraud and all sorts of criminal misconduct in elections. That's when it starts to get really interesting, because your attorney general took over the investigation and issued grand jury subpoenas and search warrants. And a judge up in that circuit stepped in, sua sponte, without any motion from any party, and quashed the search warrants. His name was Judge Marvin Wiggins. And Judge Wiggins, you'll never guess, was the brother of one of the accused. That's right. He was the brother of one of the accused. Not only did he not recuse himself from the case, he quashed the search warrants. Now, eventually, your Supreme Court got involved and unquashed his quash and disciplined him. Now, these 3 individuals were arrested, and they were arraigned. That's probably not the word in Alabama, but I suspect with such an esteemed group of folks here, you'll correct me. They were arraigned, and let me read something from my book. And by the way, this is sad and funny, so feel free to both cry and laugh. It says, they were indicted on multiple voter felony fraud counts in August of 2007. In a stunning display of racial solidarity, more than 200 people packed the arraignment hearing and loudly applauded when not guilty pleas were entered. In a corrupt appropriation of the moral authority of the civil rights movement, they all wore T-shirts that said, "Greensboro 2, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere." Outside the courthouse, supporters held hands in a huge circle around the courthouse and sang songs from the civil rights movement, such as "We Shall Overcome," and prayed for the defendant's legal deliverance. Now, I'm here to tell you that this same nonsense occurs all over the country when there's voter fraud prosecutions. That a noble history of the civil rights movement is used to excuse the behavior. And it's sickening, and it gets worse, because they eventually pled guilty. They pled guilty after they stole and exploited that noble history. And it even gets worse, because one of the defendants, Tinker, after she pled guilty and was sentenced, I forget what the time was, she ran for judicial magistrate in Greensboro, Alabama, and won. She is currently the judicial magistrate in Greensboro, Alabama. Now, y'all know what that office means more than me, but I suspect it means something. And she is in that office right now, a convicted voter fraud felon in Greensboro, Alabama. Now, with that story in mind, let me tell you how it has to do with the Justice Department. Remember, what I just told you was 2007. In 2001 or 2, it's in the book, I can't remember exactly which, a team of Justice Department attorneys went to that part of the state, and they met with Faye Cochran. Faye Cochran is a patriot who believes in the rule of law, who wanted to do something about this pervasive criminal voter fraud. And she met with a Justice Department attorney named Avner Shapiro, who I know well. He was my mentor at DOJ. And she described to him this behavior that you all just heard about. And she said, "We need you to help us." And Avner Shapiro at the Justice Department in 2001 said, "I'm not here to help you, I'm here to help them." Because skin color. It's tragic. And so what happened is, for the next 6 years, before the convictions, those African-American voters were having their votes stolen by these 3 people. They were having their votes stolen. All the fights and wars and blood and death that led to them getting the right to vote was being taken away by these elite local Politico people who were getting cover from Washington, from the Justice Department. It goes back to those 2 different worldviews. One is a fence that we all operate within. The other is a guidepost to take us to another destination. And that destination that Avner Shapiro believed in was political power for a certain faction in Perry and Hale County. Compliance with the law wasn't as important as who won the sheriff's race. So that's the first Alabama story. The second place where this divergent worldview shows up is in the area of voter ID. Now, as I told you, the 15th Amendment prohibits racial intent. In other words, you can't have a statute that is passed with a racial intent. Well, let me tell you how the South Carolina voter ID worked, because it relates to Alabama. When you know you all have to submit all of your laws to justice in Alabama for pre-clearance under Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. No election statute in Alabama can become law unless Washington approves it. So when South Carolina submitted their law, the lawyers of the Justice Department said, okay, we think this was enacted with a racial intent because there's no pervasive voter fraud in South Carolina that you can demonstrate. Now, I won't bore you with a jurisprudential lecture about a case called Crawford v. Marion County out of Indiana, where Justice Stewart said, was it Stewart? It was Stevens, that's right. Thank you, Quinn. Justice Stevens said, you don't have to have a lot of voter fraud to pass voter ID. You can pass it ahead of time. Okay? Well, the Justice Department, ignoring this fence that the Supreme Court constructed on these issues, the lawyers began to interrogate South Carolina, asking questions such as, who did you talk to about this law? What books were you reading to pass this law? Sound familiar? They didn't ask about prayers, but they were doing this intrusive probing of what their frame of mind was. Did you talk to any Tea Party groups? Did you, speaking of tea, did you talk to any conservatives or constitutionalists? Give us the list of names. And so you have the same sort of thing happening with the voter ID cases that you're now seeing with the IRS. It's once again the idea that there is a mission to be accomplished to advance a certain political cause. Now, the other thing related to voter ID is it cannot have a discriminatory effect. And in South Carolina, the statute had a 1% difference between black and white possession of ID. In other words, 90% of blacks had ID, 91% of whites. Thank you. And the Justice Department used these two means, intent and effect, to block South Carolina's law. That's the fate that Alabama, unfortunately, I think is also going to face. Is your Attorney General, who's he's actually read the book, Luther Strange, and I've heard that he's been faxing portions of it to Judge Pryor on the 11th Circuit, saying, you got to read this. I don't know that firsthand, but that's what I'm told. So I'm very happy to hear that. So this is what you guys face in Alabama with voter ID here. I'm not confident that it's going to become law anytime soon in this state. And the reason, once again, just as I described in the previous example in Perry and Hale, is you have people in these positions of power who have a worldview that is dedicated not to the rule of law, but to the advancement of an ideological cause. And the law be danged. You are not to enact things that conflict with this orthodoxy. Voter ID is bad, therefore we must find a way to block it. And that's not how the law is supposed to work. Let me go to my next topic, 3 of 3. Dead people on the voter rolls in Alabama. Here's some statistics. I'm going to read you the names of some counties that you guys will know better than me. But these are counties in Alabama that have more people more people on the voter rolls registered to vote than you have human beings with a heartbeat over the age of 18. Okay? We'll start out, this is in descending order of rankness. Number 1, at 119%, 119% is a county called Lowndes County. Everybody seems to know some significance that I do not, so I'm glad to hear it. The next is a county called Greene, which I think we've talked about, 112%. Wilcox County is 107. Macon County is 105. Then all coming in at just over 100, you have Washington County, Perry County, Hale County, and Choctaw County. Now there's a whole bunch of counties at about 98 that I didn't even list, and that's a problem too, but I kind of go by a per se rule. If it's over 100%, you have a problem. So, Lowndes County has almost 20% more people on the voter rolls than has adults alive. Now, there's a solution to this. And I just brought 2 cases over in federal court over in Mississippi 3 weeks ago under this statute that I'm about to tell you about, which incidentally, if anybody's falling asleep, it has a private right of action with attorney's fees. Okay? Attorney's fees. And it's called Motor Voter. Do you guys remember in 1993, the big Bill Clinton Motor Voter? You go get your DMV, you want to write, okay, that's Motor Voter. But what nobody knows, except maybe Quinn Hillier, who was up on the Hill when this passed, is that Motor Voter has a provision called Section 8. And Section 8 was this grand compromise the Republicans extracted from the Democrats. That, okay, you're going to get your motor voter, but we want to be able to sue if the voter rolls get too inflated. We want to be able to sue to force people to clean up the voter rolls. This grand compromise in 1993. Do you know how many private plaintiffs brought a case in the next 20 years to clean up voter rolls in the entire United States? 0. Not one. It was the classic victory by the left, and the right thinks they've won something, and they've won absolutely nothing because they don't do anything. So nothing gets filed for 20 years until Judicial Watch sued Indiana. I've got depositions in Indianapolis next week on this case, on the Indiana case. I'm working on that. Judicial Watch sued Ohio. We've got 2 cases over in Mississippi. Those are the only 4 private plaintiff cases ever filed. When I'm done with Mississippi, I'm coming to Alabama. So some of you may be getting a call. Now, how does this fit into my 2 different worldviews? The law says this. The law is just a suggestion, A and B. Well, it fits in this way, and it's in the book. When I was at the Justice Department, you notice I said private plaintiffs. The Justice Department brought a couple of these cases, one of them against Indiana in 2007 to clean up their voter rolls. We're back because they aren't doing it anymore. The Justice Department also brought cases when I was there to force states to offer registration. That's the other part of motor voter, the balance. Okay? After the inauguration, we had 8 states that more people on the rolls than people alive. 8 states, not just counties. And we presented to the incoming political people, and we asked them for an authority to investigate. I didn't say sue. I said merely investigate these 8 states. We were denied authority because they refused to enforce the law, and they said so. We had a meeting, very much like people in this room, and the incoming Obama political appointee said, quote, "We have no interest in enforcing that law. It doesn't do anything to help turnout," unquote. I know. They really speak the truth even when they don't mean to. And so these investigations got spiked. And to this day, this Department of Justice refuses to enforce the law for ideological reasons because they don't like this part of the law. Now, they're busy suing Louisiana over the motor voter part, you know, that you have to offer people registration. And they're wearing wires and bugging people, but that's a whole different story. But they won't enforce Section 8. It's a perfect example of the worldviews I talked about. One is you enforce the law, as the law says. The other is you pick and choose which laws help you keep and get power. And that's what's happening, unfortunately, is the second worldview is playing out in the election area. So what do we have? We have rampant criminal voter fraud in parts of Alabama that the Justice Department enabled for years. We have voter ID laws which are coming down the pike in Alabama that the Justice Department is likely to block. And lastly, and perhaps worse, you have a DOJ that refuses to do anything about 10 counties or 8 counties in Alabama with corrupted voter rolls. Now, if that doesn't affect the integrity of elections in Alabama, I don't know what does. What could be worse? Incidentally, in Hale, this is how bad it is. In Hale and Perry County, I forgot to tell you this important thing. Remember I told you there was absentee ballot fraud there? Well, the sheriff gathered up all the absentee. Does anybody know this story, by the way? Okay, the sheriff gathered up all these absentee ballots in I think it was Hale County. And he said, okay, we've got evidence of a crime. I'm not fooling around. We're going to put these in the bank vault, right? Where nobody can get them. And so the sheriff takes them over to the local bank. He puts them in the vault. And do you know what happens to the bank overnight? It gets burned down. It gets burned down. I mean, this is not from 1925. This was just a couple of years ago in Alabama. And so this is what the Justice Department was enabling for years, and is enabling again. If you read my book, you'll know there was a very brief window from about 2005 to 2007 where the DOJ was doing something about Perry and Hale. They were sending monitors there to watch, but there were these old line people from Model B, you know, that alternative universe, who were there harassing their co-workers who were trying to collect evidence of crimes. It's an amazing story. I write about it. I mean, it's genuine harassment of the people who are trying to do good. Now, let me close this address, and I want to take lots of questions if you have them. I also have one book. Unfortunately, I had an event last week that I got cleaned out, so I'm happy to part with this. But let me close my speech with how I close my book. Pat Caddell, you ever seen Pat Caddell on Fox News? He was Jimmy Carter's pollster. He worked, I think, for McGovern. Didn't he?
McGovern, Carter, and Gary Hart.
And Gary Hart. Okay, so this is not a wild-eyed conservative. Well, it might be the wrong choice of words. He's a pollster, and he and Doug Schoen did a poll last year or 2 years ago, and it asked this basic question: do you believe we enjoy the consent of the governed in the United States? The consent of the governed. You all have heard the term. And I give this speech all the time about this part of this poll because it's in my book, and I always ask people, think about what you think the number is. You don't have to say it out loud. But we all have a pretty good sense, walking around sense about America, what people think about their government. And I was speaking at Columbia University Law School, something I will never do again. There's a whole lot of those people be there, okay? And I had people raising their hands and saying like 40%, 50%, 60%. I had a whole bunch of people at the upper range of optimism. Doug Schoen and Pat Caddell found out that the number of people who believe in 2011 we have the consent of the governed is 17%. That's a stunningly low number. Pat Caddell characterizes this, not me, this is him. He characterizes this number as, quote, pre-revolutionary. That's his word. One of the ways we derive the consent of the governed is to have free and fair elections that are not tainted with the garbage that goes on in Perry and Hale County, that don't have 120% of people eligible on the voter rolls, and don't have a Justice Department who stands against the rule of law. And so my contention that I want to close with tonight is the one that Thomas More talked about, at least he did in the movie Man for All Seasons, where the law is what keeps us off of each other's throats. And the notion that we have a government doing the things it's doing in some areas, like IRS audits and abortion clinic protesters, and the things that they're doing in some areas, and then not doing things in another area that they should be doing something, whether it's enforcing motor voter in Hale and Perry and Lowndes County, or whether it's doing something about the criminality in elections, you have people begin to lose their belief in the system. And that's why this cause is so near and dear to me. And if Eric Holder won't sue those counties in Mississippi or won't sue those counties in Alabama, I'm going to do it. Because if we don't do it and we just leave it up to these people in Washington, D.C., I promise you they have a worldview that I would bet you almost everybody in this room disagrees with. And so thank you very much for your time and attention tonight. And I'm indeed open to questions. Yes, sir.
Sam, a telling statement. I was involved in election dispute in '94 in the Chief Justice race here. And we had a man on the stand from, I think it's from Perry County. And he said that he escaped Lithuania in, I think, the 60s. And he said, I lived there when the Nazis were rigging the elections, and then I lived there when the communists were rigging the elections. Then I came to Perry County, and the same thing's going on. And it was in Judge Howard's court, as a matter of fact, and you could have just heard a pin drop after that happened. I'll give you one more story. In '96, 2 years after that, we decided we weren't going to let it happen again. And it wasn't voter intimidation because we were filming from a location nobody ever saw us. there was no question in Perry County they were trading crack, cocaine for the votes. And we presented it to our Attorney General before he looked at the tape. What color were these people? He was so frightened to get involved in that investigation that...
Yeah, and of course, what color were those people? What color were the victims?
Exactly.
And
victims with other blacks.
You mentioned Lithuania. I had the honor and pleasure of testifying to the House Judiciary Committee in Washington, I think 3 weeks ago, maybe 4 now, about a lot of the things I talked to you about tonight. But 2 witnesses down from me was a far more compelling witness, and it was a man who grew up in communist Romania. And he told the story in great detail about his client, he's a lawyer, his client who was the victim of these abortion clinic harassment lawsuits by Tom Perez at the Civil Rights Division. And remember, I mentioned it very briefly that they went after these clinic protesters. They all got thrown out on summary judgment. The court said there's not even a prima facie case here. And he testified extremely compelling testimony about this is precisely the sort of things that he would see go on in communist Romania, where they targeted people because of what their beliefs were. The law didn't matter. The law does not support these abortion cases as the federal courts are ruling, but that's okay to the people in power because it's about the cause. And that's something that I do not believe has existed in this country under Democrats or Republicans or Democrats in our history, for a very long time at least. And now it's beginning to happen. Yes, sir?
Eric Holder, genius, idiot, or complete political hack. The reason I ask that is a lawyer, I practiced for over 20 years, you should take the depositions. I see him interviewed, I see him testify, and the audacity of which, nobody likes to say this, but which he's lying is unbelievable.
Yeah.
A 1,000 miles away, I can prove he's a liar. And I don't understand him or how he can even begin to get away with it.
Well, you're on to something. I know Eric Holder has given false testimony on multiple occasions. I've testified about other people at the Justice Department who have done so under oath in front of Congress and so forth. But I want to raise something that's a little more sinister with what you just said. There's a lot of things Holder actually doesn't know about. I mean, when you hear him say, I don't know, I don't know, I don't know, I don't know. And that's because of something far more dangerous. The government has been populated with people who think exactly like Eric Holder and the most radical sorts of folks. I used to work with them. They're my coworkers. I have pictures of them in the book. They don't need orders. They're on autopilot. They understand the left-wing ideology and the racialism and the Model B option instead of Model A, and they don't need to be told what to do. You're going to see that show up in the IRS issue. It's why the Benghazi case, it never got up to the National Security Advisor because all the 30-something aides were driving that whole post-Benghazi thing because they were all of the like mind. And so that's one of the things happening in Washington. The 30-something ideologues, I'll give you a name, Buffy Wicks. Buffy Wicks. Buffy Wicks in 2002 was a Walmart protester. Now, I know to people in Alabama, when I say that she protested Walmart, it just doesn't make sense. I mean, why would you protest Walmart? Well, I can introduce you to a lot of people in Washington, D.C. who think Walmart is evil. So Buffy Wicks starts out as a Walmart protester. She goes on to work for Howard Dean, and now she works in the White House. Look her up. She has a very powerful job there. And so they don't need to tell these people what to do. They know what to do. Yes, sir.
I think I was down in South Florida. I was a DEA special agent. And if they would have not counted the illegal vote, there would have been no problem. Okay? But there are so many folks who are not U.S. citizens. That's what the law says. You must be a U.S. citizen to vote. And they are not U.S. citizens. I know that as a fact, okay? But I think...
Why shouldn't they be allowed to vote?
That was a joke.
But also, in Alabama, you know, you Al Sharpton, Jesse Jackson, Benjamin Jell NAACP, you know, there is no voter fraud.
Yeah.
I mean, and we're trying to counter that because we know there is a lot of voter fraud out there, a lot. But how do we counter that? And another thing is, I'm so embarrassed by the federal justice system, the judges especially, who believe all this crap because they can overrule the state Supreme Court.
Yeah.
You know, and it's unbelievable what's happening in the federal.
Well, you raise a lot of very big issues, and there's so much that could be said. Look, I know there's non-citizens voting. There's been state-level prosecutions. You have a Justice Department. Have you seen the video of Meloise Richardson in Cincinnati? I voted 6 times. That's a federal crime, but this Justice Department won't prosecute her. There's non-citizens voting who are caught, and they aren't prosecuted. And so, once again, remember, the law is not a fence. It's a sign, a guidepost, and that navigational beacon, that's in the wrong direction. You're red right, you're red left returning, bad. They don't want to do it though. They just don't do it. One of the great myths is there's no voter fraud. And it is amazing how the civil rights groups, Sharpton, the Advancement Project, tons of Soros groups I didn't even talk about tonight, all have this amazing narrative that chugs along, no voter fraud, no voter fraud. And what it does is it enables voter fraud because people are afraid to prosecute. You just told the story about the Alabama Attorney General. You know, people are afraid of prosecuting criminal activity in our elections because of the racial connotations, because of the money behind the narrative, and those people who believe that are now in charge of election law in Washington, D.C. Well, look, how do you stop it? Well, how do you prosecute them? Look, I wish that would work. What I have suggested to clients, and what we've adopted with like one of my clients, is what I call leverage law enforcement. It's what the left does. They're always writing letters. Please prosecute these terrible capitalists, whatever. We don't do that. We have clients, we have lives, we have families. We're not full-time crusaders. Now, some people say I might be, but I'm not. I actually have a legal practice. We have to start putting the pressure on people. If I was in Ohio, on Carter Stewart, who's the U.S. Attorney in Cincinnati, I've published on my blog 30 days since she's admitted to breaking federal law and no prosecution. I finally gave up on like day 45. I was like, I just can't do this every day. You know, and pressuring people to do their job. That's why your Attorney General got involved in Hale and Perry a couple years ago, because he was being pressured. You have a good Secretary of State here. She gets it. Mississippi has a great Secretary of State. It just takes a level of activism, unfortunately, that our side doesn't have. You know.
Drinks one night. I tell you what, we get 96. Now keep crying. Stop it that year.
How do we get this information to the public? Because the public is the only one who's going to be able to do this.
You know, I got to tell you, I 8 or 9 years ago, I was totally on your side, and I saw the answer as wide dissemination of information and a moral, informed public rising up in righteous indignation about what's happening. I have since changed my tune. And what is it, did Sam Adams say, I think it was Sam Adams, that a vocal and dedicated minority is all it takes to change things. As a matter of fact, these days, I think that's all we got. It's a vocal and dedicated minority. The results of the last election confirmed to me that most of the public is sufficiently tuned out to do anything. I got to tell you, I was in the green room. I was going to go on Fox the other day, and I was watching CNN. I don't know why CNN was on in the green room at Fox, but it was. And they were talking about this monster up in Cleveland that they just caught. Okay. And they were doing an interview with a local reporter, a local news reporter in Cleveland, that met with one of the victims. And she said, I met with her and I wanted to bring her up to speed because she's been out of touch for 10 years. I wanted her to get up to speed on what's happening in the world, and I brought her a stack of People magazine. And I thought to myself, this is a news reporter. This was a news reporter bringing this woman a stack of People magazine so she could get up with what's going on in the world. And I thought to myself, it's hopeless. All we can do is what we're doing here and inform the dedicated and vocal minority about what's happening. And this is not inconsistent with the American constitutional ideal. The founders knew that people who love liberty are the people who have to keep it alive. It wasn't going to be the out-of-touch people.
The founders never envisioned the absolute draconian, almost dictator-like power the federal government has now. I don't think we realize on a daily basis how powerful they are. And if you do anything to rise up against them in a legal and lawful way, you'll get crushed.
Well,
You got the Second Amendment.
look, I'm living.
Thanks to Abe Lincoln for all that.
Look, I'm living proof you don't get crushed, okay? I took on, and I still take, Eric Holder hates me, right? He knows who I am. Eric Holder probably knows who Quinn is. I know Tom Perez knows. Actually, I know Eric Holder knows because he gets asked about me by Republican congressmen every time he goes up. Like all the rough questions on Holder, half of them are stuff that either I or Quinn have written, okay? And we're still here, as far as I know. Quinn, you're okay? Okay. So look, I disagree with the premise that anybody gets crushed who takes them on. Quinn, yes.
Just a setup, but I think they'd like to know about what your client, True the Vote, has been going through that's just come out in the news the last couple of days. You can tell them who True the Vote is and then show them how widespread this is. It's not just the IRS, it's just a setup.
Well, this, of course, will slightly contradict my last answer, but that's okay, because we're fighting back. We're fighting back. When I got out of justice, I met through these moments of synchronicity in life. You just happen to cross paths with somebody. True the Vote is a group in Houston, Texas, and they are doing the things the Justice Department should be doing. They're cleaning up the voter rolls. They're reviewing voter rolls to look for duplicates. They're bringing cases like the one in Indiana. They're co-plaintiffs. They're doing election integrity work. And the left has come down on them like you've never seen. Sheila Jackson Lee, Elijah Cummings, congressman, Media Matters. I mean, go through the whole litany of the Hydra. All the heads are screaming. And I knew that True the Vote was one of these Tea Party groups that was being harassed by the IRS. I knew it 2 years ago. And I've seen the letters, you know, what do your prayers say, what books do you read, all that stuff. I saw them 2 years ago. Now, the irony is that these abuses were known last year to the Mitt Romney campaign, but it didn't involve the economy, so we didn't hear about it in October. We're hearing about it in May, okay? Well, it wasn't just the IRS. All of a sudden, we started getting calls from special agents at the FBI just checking in. Want to make sure everything's okay. OSHA shows up, and my client has a machine, an oil. They're in oil. They make component parts. OSHA shows up at her shop. Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms does audits because they have the capacity to make components for firearms. Okay? The whole world starts to come in on my client because they're Tea Party groups and they're involved in election integrity. For 2 years, we were quiet. We're trying to deal with this behind the scenes. But then word starts getting around among all the other Tea Party groups. Are you getting harassed? Yes. And we all start putting together this web of harassment. And now it extends to religious organizations, Jewish groups, pro-life groups, Tea Party groups. Anybody who disagrees with the administration is being harassed by the federal agencies. But the good news is this. True the Vote sued today in federal court under a bunch of different causes of action and to get their 501c status approved. Okay? And all the other groups are starting to sue. Discovery is going to be a blast. Okay? Because you're going to start to see who's writing the letters. But they're fighting back. I mean, we have that power still to fight back. The power of the spoken word still moves minds. We still have the right to assemble and go make a scene in front of IRS offices like they did today. And so all these constitutional tools are still at our disposal to push back. The founders saw this crowd, right? When they were writing all that separation of powers and power of the purse and Second Amendment, they had these guys in mind. This is what they were just 210 years or 230 years ahead of time. But they knew that these people were coming. Now, some things have fallen by the wayside, like the Commerce Clause, unfortunately. Other protections they put in there are gone, thanks to like Wickard v. Filburn and all those cases. But we still have a lot of weaponry. And it's not all the Second Amendment. And if the House ever gets around to using the power of the purse, will really make a difference. Unfortunately, the Speaker is afraid to do it. He thinks that if they defund Obamacare, that there won't be a budget in the Senate, and therefore the government will shut down and they'll blame Republicans. He thinks it's 1995, where there's like 3 news networks, CNN, and the New York Times. He doesn't understand that there's this whole different way of waging war in the narrative. That's my view. You may disagree with that, but okay. Yes, Quinn. Anything else? All right. Way in the back behind the podium, or behind the column.
Did your understanding of the 2 world views come from just your practical experience, or did you have some philosophical underpinnings?
This is a great question. When I entered the Justice Department, I probably viewed things more like Democrat, Republican. I thought we all played by the same rules generally, like we have a common goal. All these great things about America. We just have a difference of how to get there. You believe in this. And so I had a very naive view, and then I got to meet my coworkers, right? And I slowly began to see, wow, the law says this, and I sometimes would take it to my superiors. The law says this, but they don't seem to care. What do we? And so I began to see up close how the left treats law as fungible and optional to get to a bigger goal. And then I thought it was just my own little unit at the voting rights section of the Justice Department. But then I started seeing Chrysler bondholders found out that it's not just at the voting section, right? It's not just at the voting section. If you own secured credit at Chrysler, you're learning the hard way about this Model B, right? Or if you happen to own a GM dealership and you donated to John McCain, you're finding out about Model B because suddenly you're losing your GM dealership. And so I started, and then it was the Black Panther case, which of course is the center of all of this. Because, and I left that out tonight, I suppose by accident, but we had a rock-solid case against the new Black Panthers. You cannot stand in front of a pole in America with a billy club, right? Shouting racial slurs at people in a uniform, right? You can't do that in this country. I don't care if you're black, white, Latino, I don't care, you just can't do it. It meets the statutory definition of Section 11B. You can't do it. They didn't even answer the complaint. They defaulted. They were in default in that case. And they ordered the case dismissed. That's when it really hit home. We have got a real problem on our hands in this country. And because it's not because of